Presley, Marilyn Monroe, John F. Kennedy. If you think about the most famous Americans of the 20th century, the ones you'd still recognize after all these years, Elvis, Marilyn, JFK. Kennedy created a dynasty in the Democratic Party. For decades, some member of the extended Kennedy clan was somewhere in American public life. Now his nephew, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., is running for president, but not as a Democrat. And that's where it gets interesting. The United States has essentially created enough space for two political parties. And if anyone tries to get elected alongside, it can change everything. Dan DeSalvo is watching all of this unfold along with us. And let me ask you, first of all, about the legacy, the Kennedy brand. How big is what Robert Kennedy has inherited been for him?
Well, obviously, it's been huge. He has the Kennedy name, both first and last. So, his father was tragically assassinated while campaigning for president, and his uncle was president and was also assassinated, tragically in Dallas. So the Camelot mystique, has deep, deep roots in American public life and in the public psyche.
So let's talk about RFK Jr., the man. In some circles, he's regarded as a conspiracy theorist, as a crank. Is there anything to that?
Well, he's obviously, as you mentioned, he's not run for office ever before, but he's been in public life in a way as an attorney and as an environmental activist. And he has had some curious views on different subjects, ranging from COVID to the environment, that shade into kind of conspiracies, or at least interpreted in certain ways. So that might be attractive for some people, but some people think that there is a bit of potential crankiness to RFK Jr.
Well, I've got to ask you about one more thing, because it's the weirdest story in American politics. He is said to have half a dead worm in his brain. How much do we know about that?
Well, this has been reported on that, he's had this surgery and had this worm removed. I confess I'm not a doctor. I know virtually nothing about this potential disease, so I hate to comment on something I know almost nothing about. Certainly, one could say that story about, this medical issue that he's had plays into your last question, which is there something a little off about the guy, right? So in that sense, politically, the story fits with this broader narrative of RFK is perhaps a touch unhinged.
So we have a candidate here who publicly acknowledges that he was a heroin addict for 14 years, who has some ideas that make people very uncomfortable, who isn't running for a political party or is running for who knows which political party in which particular state. Who's going to vote for him?
Well, it's a terrific question. I think here there's a lot of voters that are potentially, you could say, low information voters. They don't follow politics closely, but this name, RFK, the Kennedy family, the Kennedy mystique, that gives a kind of aura of credibility if you're not following the news about some of the checkered elements of RFK's past that you mentioned. And I think the second feature of some of these low information or voters is they're not strongly attached to either political party. Many of them voted for Obama, then they voted for Trump. What they're after is some sort of change, right? Some sort of anti-establishment candidate that's sort of against the system, and RFK Jr. certainly offers that.
Okay, but let's move into the politics then. The United States is essentially a two-party system. He is not running for either party. How hard is it for him, still at the outset really, to wage a credible campaign?
Well, this has been an issue for third parties in presidential elections, going back years. As you mentioned, our system is a strongly two-party system, in part because it's very hard for third parties to get on the ballot. That doesn't mean that they don't do that and they don't shape important races. In our recent memory, Donald Trump might not have been president in 2016 without the Green Party candidacy of Jill Stein. George W. Bush might not have been president in 2000 if not for the campaign of Al Gore the campaign of Ralph Nader in Florida. So these third parties, while they're small and they don't get a lot of votes, can have an outsized impact on our presidential elections. And RFK's campaign certainly has the potential to do that, even though he's not on the ballot in very many states yet. He's on the ballot in a hugely important state, which is Michigan. And so both parties are going to be competing very closely for the Electoral College votes of Michigan. So already RFK's campaign, even though he's not on the ballot in many states, could have a big impact.
You covered a lot of ground. I want to go back to both of the points you mentioned, but the first one is this. Democrats and Republicans who run for president are on the ballot in all 50 states. That's the way it works. It seems kind of unfair, but just to be clear about this, if you run for a third party, you have to fight your way onto the ballot state by state, right?
That's correct. You have to fight your way onto the ballot state by state. Each state has a different process, often involving the collection of signatures, and then these signatures are often contested by the main parties, the Republicans and the Democrats. Just to use the example of Ralph Nader, who I mentioned in 2000, Nader spent most of his campaign money that he raised fighting legal battles to get his name on the ballot in all 50 states. So that's the process that the Green Party with Jill Stein today is in, that other potential third-party candidates like Cornel West, a former university professor, and of course RFK, are all in this process now of fighting to get their names on the presidential ballot.
And most Americans, frankly, seem pretty comfortable with this unfair exclusion and tend to regard third-party candidates with a particular name as spoilers, like somehow their very presence is ruining the election. Why is that?
Well, it's interesting if you look at public opinion on third parties. Americans are often open to the idea of a third party, meaning that they're not, especially today, strongly in love with either of our two major parties. In the abstract, the American people are open to this idea of a third party. But when the chips are down and we actually have a real third party candidate, meaning RFK or one of these other people, support often tends to evaporate, right? And they move back towards the mainstream candidates. Then this goes to this phenomenon that you mentioned of the spoiler, meaning in really close races in particular states, and we mentioned Michigan already, which is likely to be very close, an important state that has a lot of votes in the Electoral College. Well, even a few thousand votes being siphoned off to, say, RFK could change who wins between Trump and Biden and wins that state, because we have this winner-take-all system in each state.
Now, you mentioned this ambivalence. People in theory are for it, then when given the actual concrete candidate running as a third-party candidate, they're against it. But we have two candidates, as you say, for the major parties who are singularly unpopular. So fair to say that RFK Jr. he's found his moment. This is a very good election for a third-party candidate to get votes and to have an impact?
He potentially could have a major impact, and he could rack up some serious votes. But let's take a historical example just to put that potential in context. Think back to before the internet age. In 1992, Ross Perot ran as a third-party candidate, and Perot won 20% almost of the popular vote. But how many Electoral College votes did Perot win? The answer, 0. So he wasn't, in a sense, competitive. As a result of that election, Bill Clinton won. Most people interpreted it as Perot siphoning off votes from George H.W. Bush. And Clinton became president by only winning 43% of the popular vote, meaning he didn't win even close to a majority of the popular vote. The Democrats have been more worried about RFK up till fairly recently, and developed some strategies for dealing with his potential candidacy. But Trump might have something to worry about too from an RFK on the ballot.
So we're talking about this like it's some kind of historical oddity, an anomaly from races people barely remember. This really could swing this election.
It very much could.
What do you think is going to happen? He's trying to raise money. He's trying to get on the ballot. And as you mentioned, the two campaigns are both trying to figure out what to do about him. If you had to look into a crystal ball, where does this go? Are we going to be talking about RFK Jr. a whole lot more in the weeks to come?
I think we probably will. I think the biggest question is really the election comes down right now to a handful, maybe a half dozen swing states that are really going to decide the election. RFK being on the ballot in California, which he already is, that doesn't really matter in the bigger picture because the Democrats are so strong and Biden's support is so strong in California that he's pretty much guaranteed to win, even if some potential voters for Biden's go off and vote for RFK. It's in these states like Michigan, in Arizona, in Pennsylvania. Those kinds of states, that's really where the election is going to be decided. If RFK gets on the ballot in Texas, Trump is still likely to win Texas. So I think for people following along and following this election, the importance of third parties is really going to come down to these, half a dozen swing states and how much of the third party vote happens in those states, because almost all the rest of the states and electoral college votes are locked in already.
We'll watch it. Dan DeSalvo, thanks so much for this.
It was my pleasure.